So I don't like making adjustments for multiple testing in the context of scientific RCTs, and usually it's not a problem, but occasionally you get some blowback from somebody about this. There's an ongoing debate about whether null hypothesis and significance tests are even of value in science. And the debate ebbs and flows. It was like overflowing about 20 years ago, died down a little bit, I think. And I'm not going to get into that, but I think that most journal editors and reviewers still expect to see p-values when you're publishing the results of your RCT. So talking about p-values. So I think everyone probably knows what the multiple testing problem is. The investigator sets an alpha level. It's the probability of making a type 1 error. So as an example, say you have 20 tests, each at 0.05, then if you assume that the null hypothesis is true for each test and that each test is independent, then you might expect one type 1 error just by chance from that set of 20 tests. And this kind of makes some people very nervous because you might be accepting the alternative hypothesis when you should not be. So there's lots of schemes. I mean, this is like there's a cottage industry out there for different ways to adjust your alpha. So if you had 20 tests, you could just do a simple adjustment, divide your alpha by 20, and you get 0.0025. And then obviously there's going to be implications for your sample size calculation. So in this example, with no adjustment, it's 491 per group. With adjustment for 20 tests, it ends up being 934 per group, a 90% increase. Or alternatively, if you just had 5 tests, 730 per group, it's about a 50% increase over 491. So it's a big deal. You are, not only is it more expensive, but ethically you have to ask yourself whether or not you need to put the additional participants at risk and slow down the rest of science for your study. Because there's only so many participants you can study. But in public health, the multiple testing is not at all a universal concern. It does come up from time to time, and usually when someone pulls that card out, they kind of command all the attention. There's not a lot of people who are ready to argue them down. It's kind of like the time and attention control card that someone pulls out, and other reviewers in the panel don't want to say anything against it because it's too long of a discussion. I mean, it took me an hour, right? So, but it's usually raised in the context of RCTs and definitely in large-scale multiple testing. So, genome-wide association studies, it definitely comes up. I've rarely seen anyone ask for adjustments to the alpha for like regression models fit to observational data. So what are the different contexts? Multiple outcomes. So you've got an RCT proposing to test intervention effects on multiple outcomes. So that's one form of multiple testing situation. You can have an RCT with more than 2 experimental groups and with more than number of groups minus 1 comparisons. So say you've got 2 active interventions, A and B, and 1 control, and you say you're going to perform all 3 pairwise comparisons between those groups. You got 3 groups, 2 degrees of freedom on that categorical variable, but you want 3 tests. This is what I was taught in graduate school. That's multiple testing, a middle one. I have textbooks where they claim that if you have 2 or more groups and you really only want to do G-1 comparisons, so you've got A, B, and C, and you just want to compare A to the control and B to the control, I have textbooks that say that's multiple testing. Yeah, I mean, it's perverse. It's just completely perverse. It makes no sense at all. If you ran 2 different studies, then you would have to collect, double the number of control group participants. And yes, you could kind of make some claims to scientific rigor, but it just doesn't make sense to me. But I'm going to focus on the multiple outcomes, because for me, that's the most common thing. And this is just an example study that I was involved in. It's called Community of Voices. Julie Johnson is here at UCSF in the School of Nursing, and it was her study. Got a perfect score on its 1 point, perfect NIH review score.
Wow.
10.
First submission?
First submission.
Whoa.
And the reason why is because the intervention is you go to senior centers and you start choirs, and people get to sing in choirs. And choirs really potentially have a lot of health benefits. They're cheap, they're sustainable, and everyone, not everyone, but plenty of people at senior centers are like just crawling over each other to get into the choir. It's really a high value thing. So it's not like, oh, come to the exercise class. It's like, come to choir. And everyone's like, yeah, I want to go to choir. So the reviewers loved it so much. The proposal didn't even have a pilot study or anything to support it, and they gave it a perfect score. It's like, yeah, you guys are looking the other way on this one because they like the idea so much. But it's multimodal. There's a lot of things that can happen, a lot of benefits. You know, you have to remember the words. You have to time yourself with the other parts of the choir. You have to stand up and engage your core and breath control and balance. And loneliness among seniors is a huge, huge issue.
You have to be able to sing.
Well,
about the words.
You have to not care or sing or something. I'm sure there's plenty of people who are singing that out of key. But if you're having fun, that's what it's all about. So there's going to be multiple outcomes. There's going to be some cognitive outcomes. There's going to be some social outcomes, some physical health outcomes. So we're in a multiple testing situation right off the bat. So my argument is that against adjustment for multiple comparison is that in the context of a scientific randomized controlled trial, you got a limited set of interrelated but hypotheses for each, and you're going to be transparent and honest in your reporting of results. And the arguments in favor of adjustments for multiple testing stem from kind of a Neyman Pearson inductive behavior perspective on the role of statistics in science. It's really, a lot of people believe, is better suited for statistical process control than it is for scientific RCTs. And that adjustments for like multiple testing when in the multiple outcome realm presume this kind of universal null hypothesis that you're kind of trying to control for type 1 errors across a whole set of outcomes simultaneously. Here we go. So I don't know how much people know, but Fisher and Neyman, and it's Pearson, not Person, were in a highly acrimonious debate for decades because they did not see eye to eye philosophically about the role of statistics in science. And really, it was like a 50-year knockdown, drag out in the literature. It's crazy. And the thing is that what we understand as frequentist statistics is this kind of like a hybrid between Fisher and Neyman Pearson. And like no one has claimed responsibility for being the one who did the hybridization. The theory is that it was the early textbook writers who audiences because they didn't even include references in the textbook because they figured the psychologists would never understand. Couldn't read the mathematical, journal articles. And so the authors just kind of wrote these big giant texts with no references. And they kind of morphed together these two perspectives into something that neither Fisher nor Naiman and Pearson would agree with. So once again, some kind of misunderstanding that's playing out over the course of decades and decades. Really about decision making in repeated testing situations. So like quality control. You've got a production line, you're going to sample widgets off the production line, you're going to see what the kind of error rate is in the widgets, what kind of quality deficits, and you're going to decide whether or not it's just kind of like a few random messed up widgets or whether there's an actual production problem. And if there's an actual production problem, you better halt the line and take remedial action. But you know, and you're going to be doing this quality control all the time. It's a continuous thing. So you really do have this kind of repeat experiment, so to speak. And so your alpha is a long-run probability of making a type 1 error, such as halting the production line when there's no production problem. And so the Naiman Pearson is, their perspective is really focused on decisions acting upon the evidence. So you're either going to choose the null or you're going to choose the alternative. It's not about inference or generalizing from the experiment to the world. I see Mike's nodding, which gives me a lot of satisfaction because he's our historian of statistics. To Naiman and Pearson, the exact p-values aren't really of interest. What's of interest is whether or not they're above or below alpha. So if you say alpha equals 0.05 and you have your experiment and get p equals 0.04, to them that's the same as p equals 0.0001. Fisher would say, no, that's not right because strength of evidence, smaller p is stronger evidence. And this is like one of the things that they probably argued about over 25 articles. And then, you know, in Naiman Pearson, there's this whole idea that experiments will be repeated numerous times, each drawing from the identical population. And a lot of people have questioned the relevance of this for behavioral research because replication is rare. And then there's this whole idea of what's the identical population? Like, show me you're really tapping into the identical population. Can you even define the population when you're talking about humans? With widgets, yes. Humans, maybe not. And Fisher just regarded Naiman Pearson as non-scientific because it was too kind of decision-based and not inference-based. So if you go with this kind of adjustment for multiple testing, it's more in the Naiman Pearson realm, and you invoke this kind of null hypothesis that holds for all of the multiple outcomes simultaneously. But the problem for me is that as a scientist, I don't know, there's a policymaker out there in the future. I don't know who the policymaker is. I don't know what their decision space is going to be. And in my community of voices example, there might be a policymaker who's interested in cognitive, physical, and emotional outcomes. There could be a policymaker who's really mostly interested in the mental health kind of benefits of the intervention. And I don't know what choice they're going to make in terms of what they're going to focus on. And so this whole idea of having a universal null just doesn't really seem to be the right choice when you're trying to inform policy decisions who will be made by others. That will be made by others. So many have argued that this universal null is just not a good choice for scientific randomized controlled trials. And so anytime you can quote D.R. Cox in your defense, you should do it. So I have done that here, and that's about the pithiest quote I could find, which is kind of it's relevant to the nature of this problem because it's not, you can't have these little kind of pithy statements about why you disagree with one position or another. But the idea is to conduct marginal tests, make marginal inferences, and have a test-wise error rate of p is less than 1, or, you know, actually it should be alpha equals 0.05. I made the mistake that I was trying to avoid there, equating p and alpha, two totally different things. Sure that these statistical tests are a tool for inductive inference, and that marginal p-values represent the strength of evidence against individual null hypotheses. So there's still room for disagreement on this, but that's my perspective on it. So adjustments for multiple testing, sure, in large-scale multiple testing, kind of GWAS type studies. These are like highly mechanical searches for associations without the opportunity for some kind of rapid replication, not very theory informed. If you're looking at associations between hundreds of SNPs and some form of cancer, you're just searching. Probably there's a lot of null-ish relationships in your data. And if you do hundreds and hundreds of tests, then yeah, you're going to expect a large number of false discoveries. And so you may want to be a little bit more diligent in that case. Some examples below. I mean, some of these, besides GWAS, you end up, you get it into some ridiculous stuff where people are looking at, like the Bible code, looking for patterns of words in the Bible that will predict future events, stuff like that. Like you can make that happen easily if you look hard enough.
That's in the original language or in translation?
Well, it's true. It started out with Hebrew, but someone was able to apply the same kind of methodology to some Supreme Court decision. So it's really not relevant to any version of the Bible either. I mean, you could deal yourself 5 cards, and eventually you're going to get a royal flush. Say it's magical. So for peer-reviewed journals, so in my 20 large-scale RCTs, I've had 2 sets of critique come back, insisting adjustment for multiple testing of multiple outcomes. One was the COV, the Community of Voices intervention, and the other was a multimodal lifestyle intervention to reduce diabetes risk reduction, or reduce diabetes risk, excuse me. And in both cases, I wrote a response. It was an essay. It was like a page and a half, just saying, nope, we reject this, and prevailed. I mean, I used to think it was just an insurmountable thing to like tell a reviewer no to this request. But one of my investigators asked me if I would try. So I started looking at the literature and I said, well, actually, there's a lot of support for this point of view that you don't need to adjust. So I did, and a lot of the points I've made already were included, and I'm not going to read these quotes, but if you get the slide, you can see the quotes. So there's this long quote here that I include. And this is another pretty long quote, and here's like 4 here's 4 articles that are worth taking a look at if you ever want to read up on this issue. So for the first one, this was the Community of Voices. We're still resubmitting the final version, but the reviewer who requested adjustment for multiple testing was completely satisfied. Didn't say anything, so thank you very much. The editor said he was not convinced, but he agreed to let us publish without adjusting for multiple testing anyway. And he asked that we distill our argument into a few sentences. So this is what I drafted. Again, I'm not going to read it now, but you can look at it. It could be improved, I'm sure. The other article was the HAPH. It was a reviewer who said we needed to adjust for multiple testing, and the editor just accepted our argument and didn't send out the paper for second review. So I think there's some support out there for this idea that you don't have to adjust for this. But for proposals, it's a different story. Again, the tyranny of the peer reviewer can be an issue. So with a multimodal intervention, my take is that proposal reviewers are usually okay with selection of a single primary outcome per kind of mode. I think that works pretty well. You could just pick one single outcome, but if you've really been selling this as a multimodal intervention, that's probably disingenuous. For designs with more than 2 intervention groups, I think if you just propose that you're going to have more than groups minus 1 number of comparisons, you probably better adjust for multiple comparisons. If your number of comparisons equals the number of groups minus 1, then probably you're going to be okay without an adjustment. But what I usually do in that case is I say we're gonna test 2 orthogonal contrasts, 2 plane comparisons, and saying that they're orthogonal just kind of, I don't know, it's kind of a magic word, right? So it kind of seems to have always carried the day. So let's say you have A and B or both active interventions and a control. What you can propose to do is you're gonna compare A versus B, and then you're gonna combine A and B and compare them to the control. And then what you do is you power for the comparison between A and B, and then by the time you lump those together, the control group is going to be like this tiny set of people, like, you know, maybe like 100 probably is going to do it if you're talking about a study that's got 700 people. So ethical considerations. If you agree that theory-based interventions with hypothesized outcomes do not require adjustment for multiple outcome testing, then if you do adjust for multiple testing, it's unethical because you're going to end up recruiting too many participants for your study. So, you know, our data analysis in health research is really highly ritualized. It's, you know, there's a process. You collect your data, you fit your model, you get a p-value. You know, if it's significant, you report it, and you kind of do this procedure. And it's not a good thing to have such ritualized activity because you don't think as much. You just have to follow the guidelines, stay in between rails, so to speak. And, you know, but those, and adjustment for multiple testing isn't really a universal part of this ritual, but those who insist that it should be are even adding to the ritual. It's really being highly prescriptive. And to me, it implies that consumers can't be trusted to exercise critical judgment, or that scientists aren't trustworthy, and so you know they don't know enough to be left to their own devices. So we need kind of prescriptive rituals to keep them in line. And you know, I would just reject this kind of thinking. I think we need to use our brains.
Steve, do you have the same argument if you have multiple measurements of the same dimension, like 3 anxiety scores?
Well, I think what's going to happen is that if, you know, you're probably going to pick one of them as your primary. And if they really are highly redundant, then I would probably stick with that. But if they're really distinct in some way, then you argue that they're distinct and they uniquely contribute. to the information from the scientific information from the trial that can be used to inform decisions later.
Well, not to mention, you would have had to justify why you got the redundant, why you got three measures. Usually there's some circumstance under which they operate differently, so you have, under those circumstances, different. Otherwise, they usually look through each one. So you have a time area.
So the bottom line also is that if you're transparent in your reporting, and if any reader wants to apply the adjustments, they can do it very easily. I mean, the counter argument is if you applied the adjustments, the reader could unapply them just as easily. So depending on your orientation about what you think is ethical with respect to the sample size that you need to collect, people can apply or unapply your adjustments. So it's not as if it's all a kind of a black box that you can't unpack at the end of the day. So that's the end of part 2.